Imagine London at the beginning of the 20th century, impeccably dressed aristocrats, gaslit salons, carriages vying for space with the first automobiles. The city seemed invincible. Modern. Rich. In full expansion, but behind this luxurious setting, there was an invisible a risk created by a single man. An American, ambitious. Bright, ruthless. A financier capable of moving millions with a single speech, manipulating contracts like chess pieces, and convincing all of London that he was the visionary who would guide the city into the future. And, for a time, he was. Until his financial schemes began to crumble, taking London with them. What almost no one knew is that this man Charles Yerkes brought the British capital to the brink of historic financial collapse. And when it all fell apart, the city paid the price, not him. How could someone so powerful almost bankrupt London, and still get away scot-free, without trial, without punishment, without officially tarnishing their own name? This is the story behind the most elegant and silent collapse in money history and of the man who brought one of the world's greatest cities to its knees. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on the best stories in the financial world, like this video or leave a message. He wasn't a general, but he commanded armies of capital. He wasn't elected, but he influenced decisions that affected millions. At the end of the 19th century, when the world was still trying to understand the logic of industrial money, a silent man emerged behind the scenes, Charles Yerkes, a name almost erased from official history, but crucial in explaining how fortunes were born in the shadows. He understood like few others the power of credit, the chaos of speculative markets, and the blind enthusiasm of investors hungry for opportunity. It was precisely this type of man who prospered in turbulent times. While most entrepreneurs struggled to build empires brick by brick, Yerkes discovered a shortcut, using other people's money and the prestige of institutions to build his own wealth. He operated in a world where regulations were still weak, ethics were flexible, and the financial system was rapidly expanding. A perfect terrain for those who knew how to manipulate perceptions, and he did. His method wasn't to innovate, create, or transform, it was to convince, push risk onto the masses, and maintain control of the show behind the scenes. What's most striking is how he moved between prestige and scandal with the same ease with which others changed suits. One day he was celebrated as a visionary who modernized entire cities, the next, denounced as the architect of shady schemes that drained public coffers. This constant contrast created an almost hypnotic aura around his figure, as if Yerkes were the personification of volatility itself, brilliant, seductive, dangerous. And it is precisely in this contrast that the dramatic thread of the story begins to unfold. Because, behind the glamour of futuristic projects and seductive rhetoric, there was a silent mechanism of financial manipulation, a mechanism that anticipated methods used decades later by banks, corporations, and even governments. And when we understand how it worked, we open the door to the next chapter, the meteoric rise that made Yerkes believe he could bend any system to his will, even to the market. Yerkes' rise was no accident, it was meticulously constructed like a chessboard where each piece served a purpose. He soon discovered that, in the world of finance, perception is worth more than assets. If people believed he was solid, visionary, and indispensable, then he would be. That was the secret of his magnetism, to give the impression that he was always 2 steps ahead, even when walking on fragile ground. In a system where titles, debts, and promises circulated with the same speed as steam locomotives, Yerkes mastered the art of transforming trust into capital. That's how he began to infiltrate boardrooms, decision-making chambers, and the tables where the real money moved. He understood human weaknesses as well as he understood the market, politicians seeking re-election, investors seeking quick returns, managers looking for someone to take on difficult responsibilities. Yerkes offered himself as a solution for everyone, always with the impeccable demeanor of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The truth, however, is that his castle was supported by aggressive leverage and risky debt. What's fascinating is that the bolder he became, the more doors opened. He used money from one project to fund another, transferred risks, inflated expectations, and involved everyone around him in an irresistible cycle of collective ambition. This pattern echoes throughout financial history documentary modern. The system loves men who promise to transform cities until the day the system discovers the true cost of those promises. And that cost was about to come knocking at the door. Because when someone grows too fast, their enemies grow along with them. Business rivals, suspicious bureaucrats, attentive journalists, everyone started sniffing out inconsistencies. And it is precisely at this point, where expansion touches the limit of the impossible, that the story takes a turn. In the next chapter, the same ambition that crowned him as a visionary will begin to orchestrate his own downfall. With the rapid growth of his projects, Yerkes found himself competing with forces far greater than he had imagined. In Chicago, his attempt to control the streetcar lines placed him at the center of a silent war between magnates, politicians, and influential newspapers. And, as happens everywhere, history of money when enormous interests clash, the battlefield is never just economic, it's psychological. Yerkes discovered that to survive in this environment, financial talent wasn't enough. It was necessary to master the underworld of temporary alliances, promises that could never be written down, and favors that would always be demanded. The problem is that this game comes at a price. While making a fortune, Yerkes accumulated powerful enemies. Some wanted his downfall due to commercial rivalry, others, out of political resentment, still others, simply because he dared to grow too large in a city that did not forgive insolence. It is at this point that his behavior begins to take on dark tones. To keep his projects alive, he was forced to manipulate votes, offer discreet incentives to legislators, and sweep debts under the rug that had already exceeded any notion of acceptable risk. But Yerkes had an undeniable advantage. He knew the unwritten rules of the American elite better than any official regulation. He was the kind of man who could turn an impending scandal into a strategic opportunity. When the press attacked him, he used the attack to renegotiate contracts. When a politician tried to bring him down, he found an even more influential ally. To each blow, he responded with a bolder move, and this only reinforced his reputation as indestructible. But, like any figure who rises too quickly, he began to believe he was invincible. And it is precisely from this overconfidence that the great turning point in the story arises. Because, when Yerkes decided to expand his empire beyond Chicago and set his sights on London, he didn't realize he was entering an even more complex power game, a game where he would no longer be the predator, but the prey. When Yerkes landed in London, it wasn't just a change of city, it was a change of league. Chicago might be brutal, but London was a global stage, where empires were built and torn down at mahogany tables. Here, Yerkes believed he had found his definitive niche, a place where his audacity wouldn't be seen as insolence, but as vision. And, in fact, the British capital was quickly charmed by the daring American who promised to modernize the subway system. What few knew was that he didn't even have the money necessary to fulfill most of the promises he made. London was experiencing an era of transformation, urban expansion, aristocrats seeking new financial opportunities, and investors fascinated by the future. It was the perfect environment for someone like Yerkes. He presented his projects as visionary works and had a charming answer for every question. It wasn't long before bankers, railway barons, and parliamentarians began competing for the privilege of financing his underground revolution. This ability to sell the future, even without possessing the present, is what transformed Yerkes into an unlikely protagonist of empire finance history. But what truly fueled their success was a strategy as old as the very beginnings. Financial scandals. Yerkes used capital he didn't have, gambled on hidden debt, and secured contracts that depended on highly improbable future outcomes. He manipulated expectations with surgical precision. To one investor, he presented optimistic figures, to another, he hinted at exclusive deals, to bankers, he promised guaranteed returns within impossible timeframes. And so, all of London began to believe that he was the only one capable of transforming the city into the modern center it dreamed of being. However, the bigger the promise, the bigger the shadow. The more Yerkes grew, the clearer it became that something didn't add up. The London press began sniffing out inconsistencies, rivals emerged with documents questioning his transparency, parliamentarians began demanding details he didn't want to provide. It was the beginning of a pressure that would inevitably put his reputation against the wall. Because it is precisely when a man believes he has mastered the game, that the game decides to show its true rules. Yerkes' meteoric rise in London had such an intense shine that, for a time, it overshadowed even the most experienced. But too much brilliance always attracts suspicious glances, and little by little, the facade began to crack. The first sign came from financial analysts who, upon examining the capital structures of the projects, realized that most of the promises were backed by successive loans, almost all guaranteed by expectations and not by real assets. It was the kind of math that works, until someone dares to ask how it holds up. The British press, famous for its keen intuition, sprang into action. Newspapers began publishing discreet investigations, then more incisive reports, revealing that Yerkes manipulated deadlines, hid debts, and exaggerated profit projections. For some investors, this was simply the price to pay for working with a visionary. But for others, the resemblance to old, financial scandals it was impossible to ignore. The city that once praised him now watched him cautiously, as if realizing that the hero might, in fact, be the villain of the story. At the same time, rivals emerged like shadows around him. Traditional bankers, who initially underestimated the audacious American, now felt threatened by his growing influence and his almost supernatural ability to convince investors with magnetic speeches. They began to pressure Parliament, questioning the transparency of contracts and insinuating that Yerkes represented a systemic risk to the future of railway expansion. British politics, always sensitive to the smell of instability, began to look at him with a mixture of suspicion and pragmatism. And then came the final blow, an official demand for Yerkes to present detailed documentation about his financing, guarantees, and projections. It was something he had avoided for years, and now there was no way to escape. What London didn't yet know was that this request would be the first piece of the puzzle that would begin to dismantle the entire paper empire he had built. When trust begins to crumble, no matter how grand the vision, everything around it begins to fall apart as well. When the documents finally reached the authorities, London held its breath. What should have been just a bureaucratic review turned into a shocking revelation: the accounts didn't add up. There was no real backing, not enough liquidity, and worse, many of the assets declared as solid collateral were, in fact, inflated estimates. The auditors found layer upon layer of financial engineering that only worked as long as no one was looking closely. It was the confirmation of an old fear: Yerkes had built his fortune not on steel and rails, but on trust, and that trust was running out. The panic didn't start in the streets, but in the offices. Banks that had previously competed to finance their projects now demanded immediate guarantees. Investors, once seduced by the allure of promises, quietly withdrew. And the press, sensing the smell of blood, accelerated. Headlines began circulating pointing to a possible collapse, comparing the situation to other landmark moments in financial history. Suddenly, the man who had promised to modernize London became a symbol of risk, the kind of character that financial history loves to turn into a warning sign. The final straw came when Parliament received an internal report suggesting that if Yerkes's projects failed, they could drag down not only private investors, but also institutions responsible for fundamental parts of the city's infrastructure. London, desperately dependent on expanding its underground lines, realized it was stuck with a visionary and a ticking time bomb. The glamorous, cinematic narrative that Yerkes had built was now crumbling like wet paint. When London finally removed Yerkes from the scene, the silence was deafening. The man who once dominated headlines now walked the streets like a stranger in the city he himself had transformed. Without access to political circles, without the protection of bankers, and without the glare of the press, Yerkes faced something he was never prepared for: irrelevance. For a man driven by control, this was the hardest blow. It was like watching the dismantling of a machine he had operated with mastery, only now, piece by piece, it was being taken apart by hands he never imagined could challenge him. While London reorganized its rail network and contracts, Yerkes desperately tried to maintain some influence. He wrote letters, requested meetings, sent messages through intermediaries. But his messages, once received with almost reverential respect, now lay untouched on the desks of officials too busy to attend to a man who no longer set the pace of the city. It was a cruel reminder that, in empire finance history, power is not something that is lost all at once, it evaporates. Slowly. Without warning. Without ceremony. And, inevitably, the ultimate truth came: without access to his projects and without the capital to sustain his lifestyle and ambitions, Yerkes began to face personal financial pressures that he would never publicly admit. The machine he had built with audacity, charm, and extreme risk now required impossible maintenance. History doesn't record a dramatic collapse like so many other financial scandals, it records something more human and, therefore, more devastating. A kind of silent meltdown, in which a man who believed he had redesigned London realizes that, in the end, it was London that redesigned his destiny. But the city still had a chapter to write, a chapter in which its own interests, its institutions, and its investors would make a choice that would change everything. What would happen to the empire that Yerkes left behind? Because the future of the underground lines, the visionary projects, and the invested capital still needed to be decided. And London was about to make a decision that would reveal something profound about the true value of everything it had built. When the dust finally settled, London faced Yerkes' legacy with a mixture of pragmatism and coldness. His projects were too big to fail and at the same time too fragile to continue on the foundations he had built. Thus, in a decision that seems straight out of a dark chapter of money history, authorities, investors, and banks joined forces to save the city, not the man. The railway empire was restructured, bought, and in some cases divided. Sold for symbolic prices, such as the famous £1 deal, which marked the official end of Yerkes' influence over the underground system he helped to design. For the public, that single number, a pound, became a metaphor for something bigger, a reminder that no empire, however brilliant it may seem, survives without trust. The symbolic sale did not reflect the true value of the projects, but rather the cost of the instability it had created. London decided to preserve its tracks, its stations, its paths to the future, but erased Yerkes' name from the signs. It was as if the city were saying, "The work continues, but not with you." Yerkes, for his part, observed everything from a distance, already without the strength to reverse his own fate. He left London shortly afterward, returning to America with failing health and his reputation irreparably tarnished. He died 2 years later, in 1905, leaving a fortune far smaller than he had once possessed and a family forced to deal with lawsuits, creditors, and disputes that arose immediately after his death. Some of his assets were hastily auctioned off, others were disputed in court. His name did not become a street, a station, or a statue. At most, it became a footnote in official history, but one note that historians recall with fascination and caution. And perhaps that's the most ironic detail of this whole saga. Yerkes' legacy isn't in his name, but in London's underground. In the tracks he dreamed of but didn't live to see completed. In the system that became a symbol of the city, while he became a symbol of something else, the limit between vision and obsession, because, in the end, the man who thought he controlled London discovered that London had always been in control. In the end, Charles Yerkes' story reveals something simple and unsettling: not every grand vision survives the weight of reality. London got the railway tracks, the future, modernity. Yerkes got oblivion. He gambled everything believing that control and charisma would be enough, but the market, politics, and public opinion have short memories and very clear limits. And it's impossible not to wonder where, in our own financial lives, are we taking risks while thinking we are in control? Which dreams are we building on solid foundations, and which are we sustaining only on hope? Yerkes' legacy is not a monument, but a warning. If this story helped you see the world of money in a more profound way, then subscribe to the channel. There are still many hidden chapters to come. Empire of money that you need to know.